Welcome to the Museum Roadshow. I'm Becky Mitchell, and today joining me I have Will and Pat Martin. Welcome.
Thank you.
So today we're joining together because, Will, you wrote a book, and we'll get to that in a second. But first, tell us a little bit about your connection with Becker County.
I married Pat Daggett, of course, from the Frazee, and we have a home on Weimar Lake. That's pretty close, everybody knows. And that's how that happens, and it's 60 years ago.
Just a drop in the bucket then,
Just
right?
about.
And so you are here in the summertime, and then you take up residence elsewhere in the winter, correct?
We're constant travelers now between here and Florida.
Good for you, good for you. So your book, I know your co-pilot here, Pat, has the copy. We'll hold that up, and it's So I Bought an Air Force, and it's in its second printing, and it's been a real hit, especially in pilot circles. One reviewer described it as a true adventure most men can only dream of, and Walter Boyne, the former director of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, called your story absolutely riveting and inspiring. Your story begins in 1963, 6 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Whose Air Force did you buy?
Well, the Air Force is the one from Nicaragua, who's in Central America, of course. And we replaced, we were buying airplanes from them that they had used ones that they had from World War II, and now they were upgrading to the jets as the United States government would supply older jets to countries around the world like Nicaragua.
So I'm going to go off script here a little bit. You know, most men just buy a train set or a really fancy car, but you bought war airplanes.
Well, it was to sell those airplanes, it was a select audience, and it wasn't wealthy people. On the contrary, at that time, the appeal was the speed of the airplane, and there wasn't anything available to the private market in the way of jets. That has changed, of course, that was many years ago.
Sure. So why were the Nicaraguans selling their planes?
Well, at that time, they were selling them. One of the things, they had a lot of difficulty flying them, but these airplanes were the best that we had in World War II. And not only at that time, they continued to be good because many countries bought the same kind. It was the P-51 Mustangs, and that airplane now is really known throughout the whole world. You show the silhouette of that airplane to a young person, and they immediately will answer 51, 51. You know, because it has a very unusual silhouette, because they have an enormous radiator in it in the middle of the airplane that air cooled, and where the majority of the airplanes in World War II had these big round engines in them up in front. But the kids know.
Okay. So were the P-51s the only type of airplane that you purchased from them?
Yes, basically it was mostly the Mustangs. That's where my interest was, and a part of it I had to buy 2 P-47s and 2 commercial type cargo airplanes, C-45s at the time. Okay.
And what were you planning to do with them?
Well, I'd bring them here to the United States. They'd have to be flown up. We considered putting them in a truck and trucking up, but doing business in Nicaragua is very difficult, and it's very hot. And I didn't think I would be able to get the mechanics down there that would work in those conditions, or to disassemble the airplanes, put them in a box, and do all the things that are necessary when you deal with a country, a small country like that, south of the United States.
Sure. So the Mustang's a very famous plane.
Yes, it is.
And you've told us a little bit about it. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Well, it's a difficult airplane to fly, and of course our pilots and during World War II were the best in the world. We had more training, and we turned them out. So the pilot went through pilot training, was able to handle this airplane properly. If you hadn't had the training and the knowledge, the airplane had an enormous amount of accidents in the training, but the powers to be figured that we'll absorb that idea, and I like the way they use absorb because as people are dying, we'll go allow that to happen because that airplane we need so bad. So that was one of the only things in this whole thing, that the memory of that airplane was difficult. And I had pilots that had made the trip with us all the way down there, 3,000 miles from Chicago, and say they had flown it, and when they got it on the runway and started it going down the runway, the one pilot turned it around and said, "Mr. Martin, I've never flown that airplane. That's so damn dangerous." He said, "I'm going home," and he did.
Do you want to tell them about taking it to Germany?
The airplane, one of the outstanding things about the airplane, there was a bomber formation that the losses were so bad we lost 600 men in that bombing raid. The bombers had 10 people in them. The Mustang came along when it finally came along at about the middle of the war. It had enough fuel that it could go all the way to Germany or wherever in Europe with that airplane and fight a good battle when they got there. The English airplanes were built with a small amount of fuel in them so they could have the utmost of performance, but they were a defensive airplane, and they couldn't make the trip. But we saved a lot of lives by having that airplane.
Wow, that is incredible. I think we're gonna be short on time, I think, so we're gonna jump to you, Pat. You're actually gonna read an excerpt from the book.
This is an excerpt from one of the crashes down there. A Duster pilot, Pete, offered to fly one of the planes with me. Just as we took off, he drew me aside. "Well, I don't know if something's fishy around here or not. One of the mechanics just asked me which plane I was going to fly. I told him, and he said, 'Be sure you do. You don't suppose they're setting you up, do you?' After all the times they almost killed me accidentally, I don't think they could do much worse. If they tried deliberately," I assured him. With the bonuses I was paying, I figured it was in their best interest to keep me alive. About 30 minutes out, the engine started running rough. I increased the RPM and manifold to try to clear it, but nothing changed. About 10 minutes later, the engine stopped. By now, I was down to 1,500 feet, and I remember being told, "If you go down in the jungle, the trees just open up and close after you. Nobody will ever find you." So then I spotted a tiny sugarcane field. I stood the plane on its wing to line up with the field. I was about 300 feet, and my airspeed was about 150 miles an hour. Then I realized in horror that I was in a ravine, and the sugar field was above me. I dumped full flap, felt the quick lift that got me up to the rim of the hill. And as the plane hit the ground, I put my head down, and my head banged back and forth against the canopy. Sugarcane stalks 2 inches thick came through the floor and filled the cockpit. The wings cut about a 40-foot wide swath through the sugarcane jungle. It was deathly quiet. I sniffed for the smell of gas, but apparently the tank had held. I climbed out. In a few minutes, the plane was surrounded by farm workers. A European in a Jeep arrived and took me to his place. About an hour later, a helicopter took me back to the airfield. On the way back, I could see there was no other place where I could have put the plane down. The sugar cane had been a good choice. When we landed at the airport, a crowd of several hundred surged forward, each trying to touch me. An eerie thought came into my head. There was a local superstition that anyone touching a person who survived after being marked for death would have good luck. Had the plane really been sabotaged, as Pete feared? I tried to push the thought away. It could have been just another mechanical failure. But why, then, was everyone trying to touch me? From somewhere in the crowd came the shout, "El gato! El gato!" Everyone joined in the chant, "El gato! El gato!" I was a cat with 9 lives.
And of course, there is just so much we could talk about this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it when I read it. And I know that you had told your lovely bride here this would be about a 2-month project that ended up lasting more like 2 years, and all sorts of scary situations and exciting and probably thrilling situations. And I guess with that, we're just going to have to tell everybody out there to purchase the book and read it for themselves. And I thank you so much for joining me today on the Museum Roadshow.